Amanda Marshall, where have you been, girl? How are you?
I'm great, thanks.
Amanda, glad you're back in the picture music-wise. Happy to hear that you're going to be in Windsor at Caesars Windsor, July 20th. Amanda, so what's been going on with you lately? I mean, you barreled into the music scene in the mid-'90s, had some very successful albums, and it seemed you fell off the face of the earth.
Yes, I'm a woman of mystery. I hear that all the time.
Yes.
Yeah, our last tour wrapped up, I think, mid to late '02, and then I took a little bit of a break. I had been touring for about 10 years prior to that, fairly solidly. And it's kind of hard for people to understand sometimes that when you work, particularly when you work in a creative field, your life tends to really inform your work. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have a lot of time to sort of develop a life outside of your work, then the balance tends to become sort of a little skewed.
Right.
So I took a little bit of a break. I went to California, and I hung out there for a while, and
Nice.
And sort of reconnected with some friends. I bought a house and started kind of having a life. You can be extremely well-developed creatively and extremely stunted outside of that. So sometimes you really need to kind of develop life skills, things like learning how to cook and take care of yourself.
Yeah, well, stuff that we take for granted,
Exactly.
that we take for granted, for sure.
And stuff that seems, seems unimportant on a day-to-day basis, but really does inform the work that you do.
Right. Now, so does that mean your home base is in California now?
No. My home base is Toronto. My family's from Toronto, and it's funny. I have so many musician friends, and the friends that I am sort of closest to are all people who have kind of stayed closest to where they grew up. And it's funny that no matter how successful most people are, they tend to seek the comfort of home and the comfort of family when they're not on the road.
Right, go back to the roots, right?
Yeah.
Right. Well, let's go back to those early years. Like you said, I know you were born in Toronto. What's the earliest age you can remember yourself being interested in music?
Oh, wow. Honestly, I don't really remember a time when I wasn't interested in music. I think part of it is that when you're really young, you tend to seek the either attention or approval or positive reinforcement of the adults around you. And I got a lot of really positive reinforcement from a very early age. People were very encouraging, and I had a great, and I can't emphasize that enough, a tremendous music teacher as a little kid who really informed my sense of self through sort of my elementary school music education. So I was tremendously lucky. I was a really lucky kid, and because of that, I was almost, I don't know, there was never a time when I ever questioned what I wanted to do. I always had a very, very predetermined sense of where I wanted to go and what I wanted to do. And the other thing I really wanted to do was travel. So the two sort of dovetailed nicely into one another.
Around, 17 in the late 80s, you were noticed by the wonderful Jeff Healey and asked to go on tour with him. Like, how does that happen? Does he, walk up to you at some club and say, hey, what are you doing this summer? You want a tour? Or did you meet through somebody? How did that happen?
Kind of both. Jeff was touring his first record. I was still in high school. I was younger than 17 when I met Jeff. I think I was just about to turn 16.
Oh my gosh.
And I met him. He played a huge outdoor show at the old Ontario Place.
Right.
Before the Molson Amphitheater. It was when it was still the Ontario Place Forum with the big stage that rotated.
Yep.
And we would go, and it was like $8 for a show, and you could go and see 3 different acts on the weekend. And but my father actually worked with someone who knew him, and so he got a girlfriend and I some tickets, and with the tickets came passes, and we sort of wandered backstage after the show, and were introduced to him.
Oh, okay.
And I just sort of mentioned that I wanted to be a professional singer, and that sort of the closer I was coming to graduating from high school, the more sure I was that this is what I really wanted to pursue. And he, out of the blue, said to me, he turned me on to this jam that was happening, a local Toronto jam downtown that he and a lot of his musician friends were frequenting. And he said, you should come down and sing a song. Just get up and see if you really
have the chops.
Yeah, have the chops. And if you want, I'll be there and I'll play if you want. And I said, okay, great. So I went home and begged because I wasn't old enough to actually get in.
Get in, right?
And I begged my dad to take me, and he did. And that's how Jeff and I kind of met.
And do you remember the reaction when you sang that night? Like from Jeff, was he blown away or was he encouraging?
He was very. Jeff was. I think he himself had been kind of a child phenom, so he was familiar with that sensation of people paying attention to you first because of your age, and next because of your talent.
Yeah.
So I think he was like, okay, well, show me what you got, and then I sang, and right away, and Jeff was a really, he was a very sweet and kind of open person, and he was the kind of guy who was not at all, backwards about saying, about giving other people sort of a leg up.
Yeah.
Which is something I always really admired about him.
Yeah. And did you keep in touch with him over the years?
I did. We fell out of touch briefly around the time that I'd say through sort of my first and second record, mainly because both of us were on the road so much. We were managed by the same sort of company, and although our business was sort of closely tied together, he and I physically didn't see each other for, we would see each other in passing, but we were just separated geographically. But thankfully, shortly before his death, we had reconnected for several years prior to that. He reached out, and we did wind up developing a really, really close relationship, and I was really super, super grateful that I got to reconnect with him, particularly in those years, because it was a period of his life when everything had changed for him. He had children, he was married, he was sort of settled, and so I got to know him as that
side.
Well.
Yeah. Did you learn anything from Jeff over that time touring with him? Like, has any of that reflected on the music that we hear from you? Or were you pretty set in your way?
Yeah, no, I'm sure it does. I mean, Jeff always used to tease me that I had gone in a much different. I think he, because he was such a hardcore, originally a hardcore blues guitarist, and that was where both of us kind of started, playing established blues music. And I was a high school kid, and I was really into pop music, and I was trying to kind of find a way to incorporate that into what I was doing. And his influences were not that at all. His influences were like early 20s and 30s jazz, and those were the records that he collected.
Right.
He introduced me to a lot of that music, but I think he kind of, I think he was really surprised in the beginning that I had gone in a much more mainstream sort of pop direction. And I think he came to kind of, he got it. He understood why, and he understood that was just kind of where my head was at. But touring was touring's a whole different animal. And Jeff, being surrounded by people that really knew the ropes was very valuable to me early on.
Now, you put out your self-titled debut album in 1995, took off like wildfire here in Canada, charted in the U.S. So many great songs on it. I mean, Dark Horse, Let It Rain, Sitting on Top of the World, of course, Birmingham. And, of course, that first album, catching the attention of Elton John. Can you just briefly tell us a little bit about that?
He reached out to me. We were midway through the touring cycle. Dark Horse was the song that really, I think, had grabbed him. He has a very long and illustrious history of not unlike Jeff. And I guess a lot of musicians do this, where they sort of, particularly older musicians, are interested in sort of who's bubbling up sort of behind them. And we were doing a gig in Whistler at the time, and we were in the middle of this. It was just a hugely busy, sort of chaotic period, and I was sitting in a restaurant in Whistler, in the hotel, and the maitre d' came in, and he was just sort of gray. He was just white and sort of very pale and shaking, and he said, Miss Marshall, there's a phone call for you. And I said, oh, okay, well, who would know I'm here?
Right.
And he said, it's Elton John. I thought it was a joke. And I picked up the phone, and it was him. Yeah, and he had just and he had made an appearance on the Rosie O'Donnell show.
Yes. Rosie show, that's right.
And she had sort of asked him what he was listening to.
And he mistakenly thought you were American, right?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I think that was what I heard. He mistakenly thought you were American. But you never met him, so you just talked to him, but have you ever had a chance to meet him? Have you ever?
I haven't, actually. No? It's funny, we did, shortly after that, we were actually scheduled to perform together, and I can't remember what happened. He either had to drop out, or we had to drop out. It was one or the other.
Okay.
And then we actually did a show in London a few months later, and we were sort of like ships passing in the night. Like he was
Right.
performing one night, and we were performing
Okay.
the next night.
Now, okay, so not a lot of writing on your part on that first album, but then comes your 1999 Tuesday's Child. You co-wrote all but one track on that. So what happened between those two albums, like writing-wise? Had you learned something between those years? Was it more self-confidence from you? What happened there?
I think it was both, and I think when you are in a position where you have to get up on stage and sing these songs every night, it's very helpful if you have sort of a stake in what you're saying.
Right. Yeah.
And thematically, I mean, there are always going to be themes that connect universally with an audience. But songwriting for me was something that I was always interested in, and it's funny because the song that I initially connected with Dave Tyson, who produced the first record, was "Sitting on Top of the World," which was a song that I had written. And I'm not sure. I think a lot of times when you're making your first record, and especially when you're like 18, 19, oftentimes a lot has happened to you, so you don't really have a lot to say. So it's helpful to be surrounded by people who can help you articulate what it is that whatever message it is that you're trying to get out.
Right, more life experience.
Yeah. And then as you age and as you sort of mature and as you have more of a well of experience to draw from, it becomes easier to inform your own work with more of your own thoughts and experiences.
Okay. And I mean, and so many other terrific musicians / songwriters featured on that second album as well. Eric Bazillion, who wrote Joan Osborne's One of Us. Carole King, who I grew up listening to.
Me too.
Oh, my gosh. And even Bon Jovi's Richie Sambora making an appearance as guest guitarist on that song, Why Don't You Love Me? How did that opportunity come about with Sambora?
I met Richie through Don Was, who produced the record. Don had produced Richie's solo record, and we were looking for somebody to just sort of come in and whip off like we were talking about the solo, and we were like, well, what we really need is sort of like a big Bon Jovi-esque, and then the sort
guitar,
of went off, and Don said, oh, well, I think Richie's around. I'll call him and see if he can come in.
Oh, wow. And how was that experience?
It was great. It was,
interesting?
Yeah, it's always, the thing I remember most about him was him saying, you're so lucky to be really take the time to sort of appreciate where you are right now, because this is the best time of this period. When you're sort of making you're over the hump of the first record and your first tour. The second record hasn't really come out yet. This is really the time when everything sort of comes together. It's This is like the most exciting period.
Right. And did you feel that way?
I did. It was kind of a chaotic period because I had just moved to California and I was surrounded by a lot of people I didn't know, and I was away from home, and I was extremely sort of worn out. I was really tired, and it's a lot of times it's difficult to kind of stop and just take a breath, in that period.
Now, and then comes your final album, Everybody's Got a Story. More sass, less ballady. Was that a more fun album for you to do, or?
It was fun. We had the cool thing about that record was that we had a very specific Billy Mann who and Peter Asher who co-produced it. And I don't know if a lot of people are familiar with Peter, but Peter Asher is like a huge legend in the music business who, the Beatles lived in his house before they were the Beatles. And he was also one half of Peter and Gordon, who were a huge London duo in the late 50s, early 60s. And we went into the record with a really specific vision, and that was to do something that I hadn't done before and sort of eliminate everything except beats and acoustic guitar. Billy Mann was a brilliant acoustic guitar player and also a brilliant vocal arranger. So we kind of decided to concentrate on those three elements. What would it be like if you just made a record with those three elements? And it was, some of it worked and some of it didn't. But I think on balance, it was an experience for me that kind of informed the way I looked, particularly at vocal arranging and the way I was singing. It was that overall, I think, was what I took away from the album.
Yeah.
And it was a hugely exciting record to tour because we kind of got to see the songs come to life in a whole different way.
Yeah, when you're doing a show, right? So now, not counting the compilations, you've got 3 albums out, a few songs on movie soundtracks. I understand you're single, Let It Rain, was used by Canada in some, I don't know, international fireworks competition in the Philippines this past March. I mean, just crazy.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was Canada's entry.
Fantastic.
I know. So a lot for you to hang your hat on. But what song are you most proud of?
Oh, man. What song am I most proud of? Well, Sitting on Top of the World, probably because it was the first song that I sort of wrote in my living room in my crappy little apartment, upside down and backwards on the guitar. I'm not a guitar player, and I sort of picked it out and wrote it, in like 6 minutes, and there's something very kind of pure about that experience, and especially when you're playing it for other people and you're sort of like, is this anything?
Does this sound good?
Is this, I think it's something, but is it anything? And to kind of, and to then be validated by other people and then look out years later and see people singing along with that song, it's kind of cool.
Yeah, personally, as far as your upbeat songs go, that's one of my favorites. I personally, I love If I Didn't Have You. I love.
Yeah.
And actually there's not one song on any of your albums that I fast track, and because I'm a big song switcher. I'm like, I don't want to hear that again. But yours, I'm like, just let the whole thing play. Who's your biggest critic?
My biggest, well,
are you hard on yourself?
Yeah, well, I was going to say me, but that sounds terribly narcissistic. But yeah, probably me. I'm kind of my. It's funny because I was having this conversation with somebody the other day, and I was saying, my mom. There's nobody in the world who is more excited or enthusiastic and positive about my success than my mother. But there's also nobody who is faster and more, with greater alacrity will tell me when things are going wrong.
Something's not working.
Don't wear that, or your makeup looks terrible, or
But she's a mom.
I hate that song, or whatever.
She's a mom. That's her job, right?
Yeah.
Well, okay. Then let's turn the tables for a minute. And you be Elton John. Who are you listening to right now? Like any of this new music that's out right now?
Pop music is so cyclical that to me, there are highs and lows of every, there are sort of peaks and valleys for every cycle. Mm-hmm. I think Adele is great. I think the most encouraging thing to me is that there seems to be a trend sort of now back towards sort of full-throated singing.
Yeah.
Which sometimes in every period gets lost a little bit, and that's okay. I mean, that's what pop music is about. It's about the hook and about kind of creating a glossy overall picture. But I think somebody like Adele, I was and am still a huge Amy Winehouse fan.
Yeah.
Because I like unusual voices,
Now, I got to ask, is there new music coming from you?
There is. I'm actually physically in the studio as we speak.
Oh, seriously?
I am.
It's awesome. Now, what are you, like, in the early stages? Have you been working on it for a while, or?
Well, I'm always writing. I don't necessarily write with a goal in mind. I tend to write, and I'm not somebody who's terribly successful at writing while I'm doing other things, which is why I was never really somebody who wrote. I'm not somebody who writes on the road.
Okay.
I tend to write when I come off the road. So I've been writing and recording for several years. Some of it I will use, some of it I won't. Some of it will never see the light of day.
Right.
And I think most people are like that, probably more than their audiences know. But I'm hopeful that I think we're about midway through, and I think it'll probably be out early next year.
Oh, that's awesome. Of course, you're going to be doing more touring, I assume?
I am.
Okay,
yeah.
great.
This particular show coming up on the 20th was sort of a one-off because it came at a sort of an opportune time. I had a break in my recording schedule, and it was just an opportunity to kind of get out and sing. And I realized that the audience, wants to
misses
hear
you.
Songs they know.
Oh, by the way, my friend Helen says hi, and Colin wants to know when you're playing the GTA. Are you doing any shows in Toronto?
Not at the moment, but you'll be the first to know, I promise.
All right. And I got to say, you turned 40 this year.
Not yet, almost.
In August. But
yep.
I mean, I've been there. It's not so bad. Is it a big deal for you, or is it just another year? Like
no,
any big plans?
Are you kidding? It's funny because I've been telling people that I'm 40 for like 2 years. so I'm not. To me, it's like
I've been there. Yeah.
I'm one of the last people I know, like one of the last grown-ups I know, who actually gets excited about birthdays.
we look forward to seeing you at Caesars Windsor, July 20th. And I have to tell you, I saw you in Toronto. Fight for Fighting was opening for you.
Oh, yeah.
Massey Hall, I think. Like, that was years ago. And I remember walking out of there and telling everyone that I'd never heard someone sound better live than they actually did on their album. And sitting at that traffic light all those years ago and hearing Birmingham, I never thought I would actually get to talk to you. So,
oh, well, thank you.
Yeah.
That's so kind of you. I really appreciate that.
I think the songwriting, your music, your voice, and then, of course, seeing you in concert that time and just seeing the energy and the passion you have, I don't know, it's just that connection to your music. And
thank you.
Well, and my daughter said to me last night, she goes, "So, Mom, are you going to meet Amanda Marshall today for your interview?" And I said, "Oh, God, no." I said, "Oh, God, no. I would barf all over her shoes if I met her." So I promise I won't throw up at the concert. So glad that you're making music again, Amanda. Seriously, we've missed you. You know, the music scene needs you back, and I'm so happy to be talking to you today.
Oh, thanks. Well, you're delightful. Thank you so much.
And we'll see you at Caesars Windsor, July 20th.
Excellent.
All right. Thanks, Amanda.
All right.
Okay. Bye-bye.